When any problems happen in life, it's enough just to understand one thought: that there are people who have much worse and more serious problems. Of course, it may not always help, but it gets a little easier. Unfortunately, there are people in our world who like to feed on the suffering of other people. I looked at the clock on my desk. There were a few minutes left until 16 noir. In a little less than an hour, I was leaving for the weekend. Weekends are always something I look forward to, but this day had a special meaning. Tomorrow, Saturday, it will be 20 years since I married Katie. I can't wait to take her to the lake house I've booked for the weekend. I took the photo of Katie that was on my desk and studied it carefully. It was a photo she gave me many years ago with the caption, "The love of my life, Tom." This is me, Thomas West, or Tom, for my friends and family. Katie and I were in love with each other in high school and got married shortly after graduation. She insisted that we wait until our wedding day to make love, believing that it would make our honeymoon even more special. I had to admit that she was right. My parents were delighted for us and handed me a check for $100,000 along with keys to a townhouse they used as a rental property. "Just to get you started," my father said at the time. He explained that the money was the initial payment from a $5 million trust fund he had set up for me shortly after I was born. Additionally, he mentioned that I would receive a similar payment annually. He revealed that he had established the fund soon after my birth mother passed away. Although I knew she had died shortly after I was born, I never pressed him for details, and he seldom spoke about her. About a year after her death, he remarried, and that woman became the mother I knew. After graduating, I considered enlisting in the military, but was rejected due to being diagnosed with diabetes as a child. Despite managing it with a strict diet and daily medication, I continued to pursue interests like football and martial arts. Katie and I attended college together. She aimed to pursue a career in teaching, while I intended to follow my father's footsteps into the business world. Our plans took an unexpected turn when Katie became pregnant with our son Jim, just 6 months after we got married. Her delivery was challenging, and upon our doctor's recommendation, she underwent tubal ligation after Jim was born. Katie took time off from college to care for Jim until he started kindergarten. Once he did, she returned to complete her education, earning her teaching certificate and securing a position at a local elementary school. Meanwhile, I completed my degree and secured a job as an accountant at Ryder Industries. I vividly recall the day I informed my father about my new job. "Ryder Industries, huh?" he remarked. Ryder Industries had been a fixture in the business world for nearly 75 years, specializing in manufacturing and logistics. They boasted a substantial client base nationwide and a promising portfolio poised for growth. "Yes," I replied. "They're starting me as an accountant. The salary is good, and the benefits are excellent." "Good. I'm proud of you, son," he responded warmly. "I hope it works out well for you." I remember feeling puzzled by the way he commented. It was clear he was proud of me, but there was an underlying concern. I thought about asking him, but decided against it. My father wasn't one to share more than necessary, and pressing him wouldn't help. So I let it go. The following 16 years were routine. We worked, came home, cared for our family, rinse and repeat. My job didn't involve much travel except for occasional seminars, but we always made time for yearly vacation, usually in the summer when Katie was off work. I stopped attending martial arts classes about 5 years into our marriage due to time constraints from raising a child, working, and managing the house. I rarely discussed my job, though my father occasionally suggested I explore other options. I couldn't help but wonder why he brought it up, but I left it unexplored. Overall, Katie and I were generally happy. Like any married couple, we had our ups and downs, but things were mostly good. Our relationship was stable, though our intimacy had decreased as we aged. However, about a month ago, I started noticing some shifts in Katie's behavior. Initially, I attributed it to the fact that she no longer had to go to work with school being out. She began having moments of withdrawal and aloofness. Occasionally, she snapped at me, leaving me puzzled about what I might have done wrong. When I tried to discuss it, she would brush me off and walk away, only to return later to apologize. Around the same time, I found out I was being considered for a vice president position that had recently opened up. I was informed I was one of two contenders, with Alex Marlowe being the other. While Alex was deserving of a promotion, I believed I was better suited for the role. I kept this news to myself until a decision was made, thinking it wouldn't affect Katie. Then it dawned on me. There were changes happening at home. Our son Jim had just graduated high school and was heading to West Point. I wondered if Katie was troubled by the prospect of us becoming empty nesters. That's when I decided to surprise her with a weekend getaway for our anniversary, hoping it would lift her spirits. At 4:15, my desk phone rang, snapping me back to reality. It was my secretary, Rhonda. "Mr. West," she said. "Mr. Henderson called and said you need to see him ASAP." "Thank you, Rhonda," I replied. Jake Henderson III, or Jake, as he preferred, was the CEO of Ryder. "When he summoned you, you didn't keep him waiting. I guessed he wanted to discuss the promotion." I stood, checked my reflection in the washroom mirror, straightened my tie, and headed for the elevator. En route, I retrieved my smartphone from my pocket and activated the audio recording function, set to capture the next hour. It was a habit of mine in meetings, just in case something important was said. I returned my phone to my pocket just as the elevator doors opened. I exited on the 15th floor, home to the company's top executives, and headed towards Henderson's expansive suite occupying one end. Brenda Harris, Henderson's PA, a striking brunette, glanced up as I entered. "Mr. West, Mr. Henderson is expecting you," she said, her lips curving into a slight smirk. I pondered the reason behind it. What was happening here, I wondered. "Please, go on in." I nodded and pushed open the double doors to Henderson's main office. Tom, come on in," Henderson greeted with a smile, motioning me inside. I entered and settled into the chair he gestured towards, directly across from a couch and coffee table, at one end of the room. "Harvey, get Mr. West a drink, will you?" he instructed, addressing a large, suited man. I knew Harvey Strauss was one of Jake's personal security guards and wondered where the other one was. Henderson always kept two guards close by for reasons that eluded me. Over the years, I'd heard rumors, but none had been confirmed. Harvey poured bourbon into a glass and handed it to me. I didn't drink much, but Harvey knew. I preferred my bourbon neat, just like my father. I accepted the glass and thanked him. Harvey nodded but remained silent, his expression unreadable. Actually, I realized I couldn't recall ever seeing him smile. Henderson moved to the couch and sat down, having removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves. He was a large man, solidly built with a muscular frame. For someone in his mid-50s, he looked remarkably fit, I thought. After taking a sip of his own drink and setting it down on the coffee table, he regarded me thoughtfully before speaking. "Sure," he said with a grin. "Go ahead, have a drink. It won't hurt to relax a bit." I cautiously sipped the bourbon before setting the glass down on a coaster on the coffee table. "Thank you," I replied. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Henderson?" Jake smiled before answering. "That's what I admire about you, Tom," he said. "Always so polite. Always accommodating. Just the other day, I was telling Brenda how you never seem to lose your cool. How are things at home, by the way? Everything okay with you and your wife?" I nodded. "Yeah, everything's fine," I assured him. "Our son just left for West Point, so we're adjusting to that. I planned on taking Katie out this weekend to celebrate our 20th anniversary." 20 years married?" Jake exclaimed. "Congratulations. Well, I didn't invite you up here to chat. Not that I mind, I like you. I wanted to talk about the upcoming promotion. It's between you and Marlowe, as you know. The board just needs a couple of things before they decide." "I understand," I said. "What do they need?" They want to know how adaptable you are, Jake explained. How you handle pressure, how dedicated you are to the company's goals. You realize that as an executive, your workday doesn't stop at 5 cow like it does now. I understood that to be the case, at least to some extent, I remarked. Surely the board has reviewed my evaluations and examined my personnel file. Yes, they have, Jake confirmed. But they require more. They need to witness firsthand how you might respond under pressure, so to speak. I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson, but I'm not quite following, I replied. He smiled and took another sip of bourbon. All will become clear, my boy, he said. Let me ask you, how strong is your marriage? Very strong, Mr. Henderson, I assured him, taking a sip of my own drink. Why do you ask? That's reassuring to hear. You see, I'm afraid you'll have to cancel your weekend plans, he informed me. If your marriage is as solid as you claim, I'm confident your wife will understand. He glanced at Harvey and gave a slight nod. Harvey went to another door, opened it, and returned to stand behind my chair. I felt uneasy and wondered what was about to transpire. Then I noticed another guard, Lenny Jameson, entering through the door, but he wasn't alone. Katie was with him. He escorted her to Henderson and stepped back. I was stunned by what I saw. Katie was wearing a revealing dress with an open back that barely covered her, and a plunging neckline from the front to the waist. Although she looked in my direction, she didn't seem to recognize me. When I looked closer, her gaze seemed distracted to me, and I noticed something like a white substance near one nostril. Katie, I said, what are you doing here? Why are you dressed like that? She looked at me, but didn't say anything. Her condition was obvious. I turned to Henderson. What's going on here? I asked. Why is she dressed like that? She's obviously drunk. What did you give her? He smiled back. Oh, Tom, he replied. You're smart. What do you think she's doing here? And yes, I gave her something. This makes them obedient, and they stay that way for a long time. He pointed at Lenny, who was removing the bandage from the back of Katie's head, who had fallen. Then Henderson reached out and pinched her. Katie didn't react at all. I tried to get up, but I was paralyzed. I couldn't move my arms or legs. What's happening? Then I realized that Harvey must have put something in my drink too. But what? Henderson grinned at me, a malicious gleam in his eyes. He glanced at Lenny, who was standing behind Katie, and nodded slightly. She still remained motionless. Henderson reached out and stroked her hand before turning his gaze back to me. She's not yours, I snapped. Oh, it looks like you're starting to get turned on, he chuckled, continuing to provoke me. Get away from my wife, I screamed in rage, as Harvey pinned me to the ground. Henderson looked at me and grinned. Or what? He chuckled. Will you beat me? You can't even move from where I'm standing. Leave her alone, jerk, I growled. Henderson laughed again and gave instructions to his partner again. Katie walked over to him. Watch carefully, kid, Henderson chuckled. What happened next right in front of my eyes is the most terrible thing any married man can see. It was a nightmare. He did this to my wife. Her eyes were frozen with pleasure. Nothing else seemed to matter to her. Nothing else existed in her world. When they were done, he pushed her away and gave me a contemptuous look. I was shaking with rage, trying to break free from Harvey's grip, but my hands remained motionless. I looked at Katie. Nothing in the world seemed to matter to her. When I looked at Henderson, I got angry. You're finished, I shouted. Henderson just grinned back. Is that how you can talk to your own flesh and blood? He was bullying me. What expressions, especially in the presence of your dear wife. She won't be my wife for long, I spat angrily. And what do you mean by flesh and blood? Oh, so no one has ever told you. Henderson chuckled. About how my father impregnated your mother right in front of her husband. That's right, West. You and I are stepbrothers." "This can't be happening," I said, stunned. "Why are you doing this?" "Actually, there are several reasons," he said. "Firstly, as CEO, I have the right to do whatever I want. Some might call it a supervisor's privilege. Secondly, I have long harbored a desire to cuckold my younger stepbrother. You didn't think that I hired you based on your grades or skills, did you?" "You mean," I began. "That's right, West," he interrupted. "I knew your stepfather when he worked here for my father." I was young then, just finishing high school. In the summer and on weekends I worked in the postal department, climbing the corporate ladder to eventually take up the same position that my father once held. "I took care of you. And when I saw that you graduated from college, I made sure that you would be hired if you applied." "Did you plan all this from the very beginning?" I asked. "Absolutely," he confirmed. "I call it the long game. I knew this day would come. It was inevitable. And now I control you. I control your wife too. Which brings me to the third reason for all this. I intend to return what was taken from my father." "What do you mean, taken from your father?" I asked. "I never knew your father." Henderson replied, "No, but your so-called dad knew. He sued my father and the company. Guess where the money in your trust fund came from? Now I'm taking back what's rightfully mine. And I'll take it from your wife." "Are you crazy? Do you know about this?" Then there was darkness in my eyes. I woke up and immediately realized I was in a hospital room. The sound of buzzing and beeping from monitors connected to me confirmed it, and I noticed the IV in my arm. My mouth was dry and I had a terrible headache. Glancing around, I spotted my dad sitting in a chair beside my bed. He noticed me stirring and turned to look at me, appearing exhausted. Seeing me attempt to speak, he called for a nurse. A young woman in a nurse's uniform entered, checked my vital signs, and then gave me an ice chip to suck on. She replaced it with another after the first one melted. Once I had a few more chips, I licked my lips and tried to talk. "How long?" I managed to ask. "You've been here for about 4 days," Dad replied, as the nurse exited to fetch the doctor. "4 days?" I exclaimed, surprised. "So today is—" "Tuesday," Dad confirmed. "I received a call from the hospital late Friday afternoon. They found you outside the emergency room. You've been unconscious since then. What happened, son?" "Later," I said, noticing the doctor entering my room. "Good afternoon, Mr. West," greeted Dr. Pierce. "I'm glad to see you've come around. How are you feeling?" "I feel like I've been hit by a truck," I said, wincing. "Every part of me hurts." "I'm not surprised," he replied calmly. "You took quite a beating. Fortunately, nothing's broken, but you've got a couple of bruised ribs and a minor hematoma. We were worried about a possible concussion." He conducted a thorough examination and jotted down notes on my chart. "We'll need to do some x-rays, and I want to keep you overnight for observation. If all goes well, you should be able to go home tomorrow. I've also informed the police it was clear you were attacked, and we have a duty to report potential criminal activity. They'll want to speak with you. Do you think you're up for that?" "Yes, doctor." I nodded. "Absolutely." "Good," he said, signaling the nurse to make a call. Shortly after, I was taken to radiology for x-rays. Upon returning to my room, I found a man in a suit talking to my dad. Once settled, the man flashed his credentials. "Mr. West, I'm Detective Ryan Blackstone," he introduced himself. "Can you tell us what happened?" "Yes, I can," I replied, taking a sip of water. I recounted everything I remembered, then asked about my phone. "Did you find my phone?" I asked my father. "Yes," he confirmed. "Your mom brought a charger and plugged it in. I thought you might need it." He handed it to me from the table beside my bed. Glancing at the screen, I noticed a few unfamiliar text messages which I plan to look into later. I found the audio recording and played it for the detective. We could hear everything, including the sounds of the blows to my body. I focused particularly on the events following the assault. "All right, get him out of here," we heard Henderson instruct the two guards. "Take him out through the back and drop him off at the hospital. If anyone asks, just say you found him like that, got it?" "Got it, boss," Lenny responded. We heard movement, likely the guards transporting me. Then their voices as they placed me in the back of a car. "Careful," Harvey cautioned. "Don't want blood on the seats." "I'm trying." "But he's a heavy guy," Lenny remarked. "Aren't they all?" Harvey chuckled. The doors slammed shut, and the recording ended. "We obtained video from the hospital security system," Ryan informed us. "It shows them pulling up, opening the door, and dumping you in the parking lot before driving off. Some ER techs found you and brought you inside. We managed to capture the license plate of the car. It's registered to Ryder Industries. I called your HR on Monday morning to inform them of your location," Dad added. "They mentioned Henderson had already informed them you'd be on sick leave for a week." "Any news from Katie?" I inquired. Dad shook his head. "No, son," he replied. "None. I've been trying to reach her at home and on her cell since I got the call from the hospital. Left voicemails, but no response. She's probably still in New York," I mused. "Who knows what they're doing to her?" "I'll issue an APB for her," Ryan stated. "Do you have a recent photo?" "I do," I replied, pulling up my photos. "Good," he said. "Send that to me along with a copy of the audio recording. I'll forward the picture to the NYPD and ask them to do the same. I'll also request an arrest warrant for Henderson and his associates to be sent over. I assume you want to press charges." "Absolutely," I affirmed. "All right," Ryan said. "We'll handle it from here, Mr. West. You just relax and let us take care of it, okay?" "Okay, Detective," I said. "Thank you." "We'll keep you informed," Ryan assured me. "We might have some more questions later." He handed me a business card before leaving the room. "Call if anything else comes up." After he left, I glanced at my dad. I asked if Henderson's statement was true. "Yes and no," Dad replied. "It's true that his father had relations with your birth mother, and it's true he made me watch. However, it turned out your mother was already pregnant when that occurred. She just didn't realize it at the time." "What happened next?" I inquired. "Afterwards, I filed for divorce," he explained. "She kept insisting it was a mistake, that she still loved me, you know, all the usual excuses. But I wasn't willing to listen. I moved into the guest bedroom and refused to have anything to do with her. I also filed an alienation of affection lawsuit against Henderson and the company for allowing it to happen. You could still do that back in those days. Shortly after that, she discovered she was pregnant, and the court required us to wait until after you were born before proceeding any further. I asked if you had a DNA test done," I said. "You were born in 1982, Dad replied. "That was before they used DNA for paternity tests. We had blood tests, but they were inconclusive. It turned out that you, me, your birth mother, and Henderson all had the same blood type. I won't go into all the details, but things got worse at home. Your birth mother started abusing alcohol and prohibited substances and died of an overdose about 6 months after you were born." "Wow," I said. "The lawsuit against Henderson and Ryder continued, and we settled out of court," my father explained. "That's how I got the money to set up your trust fund. As part of the settlement, I agreed not to disclose any specifics about the case. That's why I couldn't tell you anything. About a year later, I met Patricia. She loved you from the moment she saw you. After we married, she insisted on adopting you. She couldn't have children of her own, but in her heart, you were, and are, her son." "So how did you find out that I really am your son?" I asked. Do you remember that motorcycle accident when you were 16? He asked. I remembered it vividly. Jimmy Reardon was giving me a ride, and although he was usually careful, we hit a slick spot that day and crashed. Thankfully, our helmets saved us, but I still got pretty banged up. Yeah, I remember, I said. Well, I had the hospital do a DNA test, he said. I needed to know the truth. The test came back with over a 99% probability that I am your father, which means your birth mother was already pregnant with you when Henderson took her. I reassured him. To me, you're my dad no matter what any test might say, which made him smile. What happened to Henderson? I inquired. He passed away from a stroke around the time you started college, Dad replied. His son took over as CEO. I hoped the younger Henderson had learned from his father's mistakes, but it seems I was mistaken. That's why you weren't keen on me working there, right? I deduced. He nodded. Yes, he confirmed. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. I wish I had now. It's not your fault, Dad, I assured him. I just can't believe Katie fell for his lies. After all this time, it just doesn't add up. Who knows, Dad mused. It sounds like she might have been prohibited substances, Jed, and had no control. Maybe she was prohibited substances, Jed, but something doesn't sit right with me, I pondered. Why was she there in the first place? And why was she dressed like that? Just then, we heard a knock at the door. Yes? I called out. The door opened and Brenda peeked into the room. May I come in? She asked softly. Of course, Brenda, I replied. Please come in. What brings you here? She held a vase filled with flowers and a large card. I wanted to bring these by, she explained. Everyone in the office pitched in and got them for you. They also signed the card. Thank you, Brenda, I said. Put the flowers down over there. I gestured towards the counter beside the bed. She handed me the card and placed the flowers down carefully. Then she turned to face me. I want you to know how sorry I am about all of this, she said. Did you know what Henderson was planning? I inquired. I knew he was up to something with your wife, she admitted. I didn't know about this, she added, gesturing towards me. What happened? I pressed further. He gave me a company credit card that morning and told me to pick up your wife, she recounted. Said she was expecting me. He told me to take her out, buy her the shortest and most attractive dress we could find, and take her to the hairdresser. He also insisted she get a bikini wax. A full Brazilian wax. I had a pretty good idea of what he intended. It's not the first time he's done something like this. So your boss hires you to train girls of easy virtue? Dad asked. Brenda blushed deeply and lowered her eyes with an intelligent look. Did you know that he gave her illegal substances? He does this to all the women he sleeps with, Mr. West, she replied. He likes to experiment. Has he ever applied it to you? Dad asked. She nodded. One day, she confessed, he gave me quite a bit. He said it was only a quarter of the total. It took me about an hour. Do you know how much he gave my wife? I put in. She shook her head. No, she admitted. He said he gave Katie 3 times as much as usual, I confessed. Her eyes widened and she covered her mouth with her hands. Oh my God, she breathed. I had no idea. Your poor wife must have been out of her mind for hours. I bet she didn't even know you were there. It really pisses you off. When I walked into your office, you already anticipated what was going to happen, didn't you? I inquired. She affirmed with a nod. I did, she replied. But I didn't expect he would have you handled like this, honestly. Do you know where Henderson and my wife are now? I pressed. The last I heard, they're still in New York, she disclosed. Would you be willing to speak to the police? Dad inquired. I'll do whatever I can to assist, she assured. She glanced at me with a tear in her eye. I'm truly sorry about this, Mr. West. Just one more thing, Brenda, I interjected. What is it? She asked. Did my wife know what was going to happen? I queried. She nodded. I'm fairly certain she did, Mr. West, she responded. I know Henderson spoke with her several times over the past month or so, and they went out for lunch together quite a few times. Long lunches. I'm not sure if anything happened between them, and he never confided in me. But do you think they did? I inquired. I'd say it's very likely, but I can't be certain, she replied. You help Henderson with these kinds of things often? Dad asked. Quite frequently, she answered quietly. So, you support what he does then? He pressed. She shook her head. You misunderstand, Mr. West, she explained. I'm a single mother with a child who has special needs, and Mr. Henderson pays me well for my help. And my silence. Well, this time, your silence landed my son in the hospital, young lady, he said, his anger starting to rise. She stepped back under his intense gaze. I swear, Mr. West, she pleaded, I didn't know they were going to harm your son. I would have warned him if I had. Dad leaned back in his chair, silently studying her. Brenda, a police detective, will be contacting you about this, I informed her. Please make sure you're available and cooperate fully. Do you understand? She nodded. I understand, Mr. West, she replied. Good, I said. And please pass on my thanks for the flowers and the card to everyone. I will, she said, wiping away a tear. Again. I'm sorry. With that, she left the room. Once the door closed, I turned to my dad. That sheds some light on it, I remarked. Katie's been acting strange since school ended. I initially thought it was because Jim left for West Point. We'll get to the bottom of it, he assured me. There was a knock on the door, and a hospital orderly entered with a food cart. Dad stood up with a smile. Looks like dinner time, he said. I should head home before your mother sends out a search party. Thanks, Dad, I said. Say hello to Mom for me and tell her I love her. I will, son, he said, giving me a fist bump. He left the room, exchanging smiles with the orderly, who then placed the food on my tray. It smelled surprisingly good, and I realized I was quite hungry. It had been days since I had eaten properly. I ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes with an appetite. I especially liked the mushroom gravy. Although according to Mom and Katie, it wasn't enough. Surprisingly, I even liked broccoli, a vegetable that I usually avoid. After finishing a cup of pudding, I took a sip of coffee and decided to check my phone. 4 messages arrived, each of which was accompanied by a video clip. The first, dated Friday, said simply, "Enjoy it. I bet you wish you weren't here." Not recognizing the number, I opened the video and immediately regretted it. The video began with Katie standing in front of a group of grinning men in the same short dress that I remembered the last time I saw her. I recognized them as members of the board of directors. I was feverishly thinking that this would only add millions to the lawsuit. The video went on for what seemed like an eternity. I watched men mock my wife, who is clearly not herself. Fortunately, the video ended, leaving me feeling sick. Gathering my courage, I reluctantly opened the next message sent early Saturday morning and watched another video, which I immediately regretted, and moved on to the next one. After watching the third video, I moved on to the fourth, which was much worse, where my wife uttered the following words. "Jake Henderson is my master," she replied in a flat voice. "That's right," he confirmed. "What's your new name?" "My new name is a thing," she replied with a malicious grin. "That's right. And what is your new role, thing?" Henderson asked. "I'm a toy for the owner," she said matter-of-factly. "I do whatever he tells me to do." I didn't finish watching and turned off the video as soon as possible. I was overwhelmed with emotions: hatred, anger, sadness, disappointment. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed and heard. My once loving wife, with whom we lived for 20 years, has now turned into a toy for Jake Henderson. As far as I was concerned, he could have her. I glanced at the wedding ring on my finger. It no longer held any significance for me, so I took it off and tossed it onto the nightstand. Maybe I thought I could sell it and get a few bucks at a pawn shop. At this point, I was certain I would divorce Katie. I didn't care what Jake thought about it. I also planned to make him pay. But how? Alienation of affection lawsuits were an option in my dad's day, but not anymore. Killing the bastard crossed my mind, but honestly, he wasn't worth going to jail over. I called Ryan and filled him in on the videos and Henderson's threat. He asked me to forward them and said he'd be in touch. Following his instructions, I turned off my phone. I briefly considered calling Katie, but dismissed it as pointless. Placing the phone on the nightstand, I tried to distract myself with TV before falling asleep, dreaming of happier times when my wife was loving and faithful. The next morning I woke to the sounds of nurses checking my vital signs and monitors. 2 of them escorted me to radiology for more x-rays before returning me to my room. After they settled me back in, an orderly brought breakfast. Dr. Pierce entered my room shortly after I had finished my bacon and eggs, delivering the good news that everything checked out fine and I could head home. He wrote me a prescription for pain and gave me some instructions. "It'll take about an hour for the discharge paperwork, so why don't you call your parents to come pick you up?" he suggested. "You should be ready to go by the time they arrive. Take care of yourself and make sure to schedule a follow-up with your regular doctor within the week." "Thank you, doctor," I replied. "I will." After he left, I phoned my parents to share the good news. They arrived at my room about an hour later. Mom embraced me, her eyes glistening with tears. "Oh, Tom, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said. "How are you feeling?" "I've had better days, Mom," I admitted. "Well, I brought over some of my lasagna and warmed it up in your oven," she said. My mom's lasagna was my favorite, oozing with layers of cheese, mushrooms, and meat. It was the ultimate comfort food. I smiled at her. "Thank you, Mom," I said gratefully. "Your lasagna always cheers me up." "I'm glad, honey," she replied. "Your dad told me about what happened, and I'm furious. I would like to punish this woman thoroughly if she were here." Dad and I exchanged surprised glances. I had no doubt that she would have carried out her threat if Katie had been at arm's length. "So, any updates?" Dad inquired. I briefed him on the videos and Henderson's threat. "Videos?" Mom queried. "Trust me, Mom, you really don't want to see them," I cautioned. "They're worse than bad." "Sounds like you'll be needing a good divorce lawyer," Dad remarked. "Yeah," I agreed. "I don't see how we can move past what she's done, probably still doing, and I need to let Jim know. He's going to be devastated." "I'll start making some calls," Dad offered. Just then, a nurse entered with my discharge papers and instructions. They insisted I use a wheelchair, so Mom and Dad accompanied me as the nurse pushed me. At the loading area, I settled into the back seat. Dad drove us home, stopping at the pharmacy for my pain pills along the way. My car was in the driveway when we arrived. "We picked up your car from Ryder on Saturday," Dad informed me. "Katie's car is still in the garage." Inside, the house felt emptier without Katie. The aroma of lasagna in the oven lifted my spirits momentarily. "I freshened up the place a bit yesterday afternoon," Mom said. "It was starting to feel a bit stale." "I appreciate it, Mom," I replied gratefully. "Thanks for everything. I think I can manage from here." Just then, a dark sedan pulled up outside. Ryan stepped out of the driver's side, accompanied by another man in a suit. I opened the door and invited them in. "Detective Blackstone," I greeted. "Please, come inside." Holding the door, I welcomed them in. Ryan shook my hand and I introduced him to my mother. They exchanged greetings. Mom asked if we wanted anything to drink, coffee or Coke. Ryan declined. "No, thank you," he said politely. Then turning to the other man, he introduced him as Detective Hawthorne from the NYPD Homicide Division. I was momentarily shocked but composed myself to shake Hawthorne's hand. We settled in, trying to make ourselves comfortable. Homicide? I repeated in disbelief as Hawthorne handed me a photo. It was Katie's face, but with closed eyes and an unnatural pallor. "Can you confirm if this is your wife in the photo?" he asked. "It looks like Katie," I replied, taken aback. "But she was alive Sunday morning. I have video evidence." "Did your wife have any distinguishing marks or tattoos?" Hawthorne inquired. "Yes, a small dolphin tattoo on her right thigh," I recalled. "She got it on a dare 15 years ago." Hawthorne exchanged a glance with Ryan before turning back to me solemnly. "I regret to inform you, Mr. West, that it seems your wife may have been murdered," he informed me. "Murdered?" I exclaimed. "How? When?" "We're still piecing it together," Hawthorne explained. "Her body was found in a shallow grave in Central Park yesterday afternoon. The initial assessment suggests a massive heart attack, but the circumstances are suspicious. We're awaiting toxicology results for more clarity. Can you provide any insight?" I briefed them both on the entire situation. Ryan listened attentively and took notes, despite being familiar with the details. I retrieved my phone and played the audio for them, followed by showing the videos. My mom, who hadn't previously heard or seen any of it, started crying. Dad escorted her out so I could converse privately with the detectives. After they finished viewing the video, I relayed Brenda's statements to them. Both detectives took notes and exchanged a glance before addressing me. "That explains the bruising and Mrs. West's condition," Hawthorne remarked, turning to me. "And this Harris woman," he began, "is she working today?" "As far as I know," I replied. "We'll need to talk to her," Hawthorne instructed Ryan, who nodded in agreement. Turning back to me, Hawthorne asked, "What can you tell me about the prohibited substances Henderson used? This super ecstasy?" "I only know what Brenda told me and what I witnessed," I replied. "The doctors said whatever they gave me had already left my system. What about Henderson and his crew?" "Ryan mentioned they hoped I could provide some answers," I said. "Henderson's jet departed New York last night, supposedly headed back here according to the flight plan filed by his pilot. However, there's no record of it landing. Any idea where else he might have gone?" "Ryder has offices scattered across the country," I replied. "Could be anywhere." "All right," Hawthorne said, glancing at Ryan. "We'll need to involve the FAA and likely the FBI." "I have a contact at the local FAA office," Ryan said. "We can head there after executing the search warrant at Ryder's." "What happens now?" I asked. "If your information checks out, this could escalate to a federal case," Ryan explained. "Given Henderson's interstate actions, your wife's situation, we're considering charges like murder and possibly kidnapping." "In the meantime," Hawthorne added, "we'll finish our procedures and release your wife's body. It might take a few days. We'll also pursue those individuals from the video to gather more leads." I nodded in acknowledgement. Ryan exchanged a look with Hawthorne. "I'd like to speak with Mr. West privately, if possible," Ryan said. Hawthorne glanced at me and agreed. "Of course I'll step out," he said. "I'll be just outside if you need anything, Mr. West." "Thank you, Detective," I replied, shaking his hand. Once Hawthorne left, Ryan turned back to me. "Tom, I'd like to discuss your wife's situation with you privately," Ryan began. "I appreciate that, Ryan," I said. "Ryan spared me the details," Ryan said. "But based on my research and discussions, the last 48 hours of her life have been terrible. I consulted with a forensic expert in the East who confirmed my suspicions. I don't believe your wife agreed with what happened. I think she was brutally attacked and exploited by a group of power-hungry individuals." Ryan, I appreciate your concern, I replied. I really appreciate it. But the truth is, Katie and Henderson had been dating for a month before all this happened. I'm not really sure what happened between them, but I have a good idea. Katie could have put an end to this at any time before last Friday. But she didn't do it. I don't understand why she made such a choice, and now I'll never understand. I understand, Ryan said quietly. He took a business card out of his pocket and handed it to me. I think you should see a psychologist, Tom. Dr. Harmon is a great authority in this field. Call her, okay? I'll do that, thanks, I said. I'm worried that Henderson's accomplices may be targeting you, he continued. I would allocate officers to protect you, but our resources are limited. However, I will increase patrols in your area. Do you have a firearm? No, I don't know, I replied. He nodded solemnly. Okay, he said. Make sure to keep your windows and doors closed and locked at all times then. If you notice anything suspicious, call 911 immediately. I'll do that, Ryan, I replied. Just then, Hawthorne returned to the house. Just spoke with your partner, Johnson, he said. He's issued a nationwide APB and has obtained search warrants waiting for us. Ryan nodded and got up. We'll keep in touch, Tom, Ryan said, shaking my hand. Hawthorne extended his hand. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. West, he said. Thank you, Detective, I responded. After they left, my parents returned and sat down. Are you going to be okay, son? Dad asked. I think so, Dad, I said. I have a couple more calls to make and I need to make them. That was certainly true. I needed to inform Jim about his mother and call Katie's parents as well. All right, if you need anything, just give us a call, okay? Dad said. I will, Dad, thanks, I said. We hugged and I watched as they left. I dialed Jim's cell and left a message. I anticipated it might be some time before he responded. The next call ahead of me was one I wasn't looking forward to. Katie's father, Bill Anderson, had served as a retired Marine colonel. He was a highly decorated combat veteran known by the nickname Bloody Bill from his time in Afghanistan. Although I never heard all the specifics, rumor had it he had taken down several Taliban insurgents armed only with a knife. Whenever I saw him in uniform, he bore more ribbons and medals than any military man I'd ever seen. Several years after retiring from the military, Bill and Katie's mother, Alice, moved to a home in the countryside. Known affectionately as the Colonel, he commanded respect from everyone. I was apprehensive about breaking the news of his daughter's death to him. Thankfully, we had a good rapport and he'd insisted I address him as Dad. Taking a deep breath, I dialed his number. Bill said Anderson residence when he picked up the phone. Dad, it's me, Tom, I said. Are you all right, son? He asked. You sound devastated. No, Dad, I'm not, I replied. I just returned from the hospital and found out that Katie has passed away. Dead? He exclaimed. Hospital? Why were you at the hospital? Is that where she died? What happened? It's a bit, complex, I explained. Complex? He pressed. What do you mean, complex? I gave him a condensed version and waited for it to sink in. I could almost hear him processing it all. After a pause, he spoke. We'll be there at 1600 hours, he said. That's 4 p.m. for you civilians. I know, Dad, I chuckled. And have a fresh pot of coffee ready, he instructed. I will, I affirmed. We ended the call, and as I leaned back, the weight of everything hit me. Suddenly, the reality of it all washed over me, and I began to cry. It felt like I'd lost everything that mattered. My marriage had been falling apart for some time, though I hadn't realized it. And now, the woman I truly loved was gone. Despite everything, I didn't want her dead. Henderson, though, was another story. I rose from bed and had some of Mom's lasagna, a dish that had always brought comfort in the past and did so again this time. After eating, I tidied up and wandered through the house. reminiscing about the life Katie and I had shared. Every corner, every nook and cranny held memories for me. It became clear I couldn't remain here. Once everything settled down, I resolved to sell the house and downsize. On Katie's nightstand, I spotted her phone, still connected to its charger. Curious, I decided to check if there were any clues as to why she had taken her own life. The phone was locked, but I remembered her usual 4-digit code and entered it. The screen lit up immediately. I noticed several missed calls from Henderson and a few from Brenda's office number. The most recent call was from that Friday morning. I glanced through her text messages and found a conversation with Henderson from a few months ago, but it didn't offer much context. Their messages were pretty vague. They could have been discussing the weather for all I knew. I also checked her emails but didn't find anything suspicious. I turned off the phone and placed it back on the nightstand. Checking the time, I realized it was already 3:45 p.m. I hadn't realized how much time I'd spent on Katie's phone. Knowing the Colonel's punctuality, I headed to the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of coffee, strong just as he preferred. At exactly 4:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. I knew it was the Colonel, so I opened the door and welcomed him and Alice inside. "Damn, son, did no one ever teach you to duck?" the Colonel joked when he saw my face. "My dad tried, but I never quite got the hang of it," I replied with a half-smile. "Come on in." As they entered the house, another car pulled into the driveway and came to a stop. A tall, lean man emerged from the car and headed towards the door. "I hope you don't mind," Bill said. "After hearing what you told me, I took the liberty of bringing in some backup." By now, the tall man had entered the house with a laptop bag slung over one shoulder and 2 other bags in his hands, leaving me curious about the situation. Bill turned to the man. "Ron, this is my son-in-law, Tom West," he introduced. "Tom, meet Ron Wiseman. We served together in the Corps." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Wiseman," I greeted him, shaking his hand. "Please, call me Ron," he replied. I glanced at the Colonel. "Ron and his wife have dealt with individuals like Henderson before," the Colonel explained. "Plus, he's skilled in ways that could be very useful." "Oh?" I inquired. "What kind of skills?" "I'm actually a trained accountant," Ron said. "An accountant?" I repeated, surprised. Ron smiled as he set down his bags. "Well, it's a bit more than that," he clarified. "I do some work for a special task force, and I have access to information that could be quite helpful, judging by what the Colonel mentioned." "I see," I nodded. "Well, please have a seat. I'll go get us some coffee." Alice joined me in the kitchen, and we returned with 4 large cups of coffee. The Colonel preferred his coffee hot, fresh, black, and strong. Alice handed him his cup, and he cautiously took a sip before setting it down. "Nice job, Tom," he complimented. "Thanks. So, why don't you bring us all up to speed?" I briefed them on everything that had happened up until Ryan and Hawthorne had departed from the house earlier. "You mentioned there are videos?" inquired the Colonel. "Yes," I confirmed, and they're quite explicit. "I'd like to see them nonetheless," he replied. "After 30 years in the Corps, there's not much Alice and I haven't come across." I retrieved my phone and queued up the videos. They viewed all 4 before returning the phone. Bill and Alice seemed visibly disturbed by what they had witnessed. Ron, on the other hand, remained composed, pausing the videos occasionally to scrutinize the individuals involved more closely. "It's clear she was prohibited substances, Jed," observed Alice. Bill and Ron nodded in agreement. "But with what exactly?" "I'm not certain," I admitted. "Brenda, Henderson's assistant, mentioned he was developing some kind of super ecstasy or similar." "And Henderson prohibited substances, Jed, you too?" queried Ron. "Yes," I confirmed. But the effects had worn off by the time I received medical attention at the hospital. By now, Ron had his laptop out and powered up. I provided him with my home Wi-Fi password, and he connected to the internet. Ron inquired about the individuals who assaulted you, I explained, and asked if they appeared in the videos. Yes, I confirmed, pulling up a video and freezing the frame for Ron to identify them. That's Harvey Strauss and Lenny Jameson right there, I pointed out. Could you send me those videos? Ron requested, providing an email address. Sure, I replied, forwarding the video. Ron acknowledged receiving the files and began examining them. You know those aliases aren't their real names, Ron informed me. No, I didn't know that, I admitted. Who are they then? They're ex-mob enforcers, Ron revealed. They disappeared after their boss, James Brolin, a.k.a. Jimmy the Weasel, was found murdered. The feds have been hunting them for some time. How long have they been working for Henderson? About 2 years now, I answered. Why? That's around the time they vanished, Ron noted. You mentioned there's a nationwide APB out for Henderson? Yes, I confirmed. Okay, Ron said, clicking his mouse. Let's see what we can find out. I'll let the program run for a bit. We conversed while Ron's program worked its magic. So here's the plan, the colonel said later. Ron will stay here with you until we neutralize these guys. I'm not comfortable leaving you alone while they're still out there, he assured me. Ron, keep me posted the moment you have any updates on them, understood? Got it, Colonel, Ron acknowledged. What do you plan to do? I asked Bill. It's better if you don't know, son, he replied. Let's just say Marines look after their own. Don't worry. Henderson and his gang will pay for this one way or another. You mentioned you're on sick leave until Monday? Yeah, I confirmed. What are your plans after that? He inquired. I can't stay at Ryder anymore, not after all this, I said. I've decided to resign on Monday and downsize to something smaller. I don't blame you, he sympathized. Any update on when Katie's body will be released? Hawthorne said it might take a few days, I answered. If you need help with the arrangements, just let us know, he offered. Thanks, Dad, I appreciate it, I said. Bill stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. Alice and Ron followed suit. We should get going, dear, Bill said. Ron, keep me posted the moment you find out anything. I will, Ron assured him. Bill turned to me and unexpectedly gave me a fatherly hug, a gesture I'd never seen from him before. Everything will be all right, son, he assured me. Alice stepped in after he let go, giving me a gentle hug of her own. I'm so sorry, Tom, she said softly. Don't worry about a thing, okay? I reassured my mom, I won't, Mom, and thanked her for coming over. You're welcome, she replied, and call if you need anything. Shortly after they left, my phone rang. It was Jim. I picked up and settled in to explain what had happened. Initially, he was taken aback. Dad, that doesn't sound like something she would do, Jim said. I know. It doesn't make sense to me either, I responded. Any clues why she did this? He asked. No, son. I checked her phone and email but found nothing, I explained. Maybe she has a burner phone, Jim suggested. A burner phone? I queried. Yeah. One of those disposable types you pay as you go, Jim explained. Maybe she has one you haven't found yet. My thoughts turned to the videos I had received from an unknown number. Could that be her burner phone? If so, it could be anywhere by now. I think you're on to something, I said. That hadn't crossed my mind. We continued our conversation for a while longer and ended the call with Jim asking me to inform him when his mother's body would be released for the funeral. Afterward, I brought up the idea of using a disposable phone to Ron. That makes sense, he replied. If you have the number, I'll see what I can find out. I gave him the number, and he quickly accessed another program to enter it. A few minutes later, he had an answer. The number belongs to a phone bought locally, he said. As you suspected, it's a burner phone. It's registered under rider's name and was last pinged in New York on Tuesday morning. There hasn't been any activity since you received the last video. Do you have any idea where it might be now? I asked. No clue, he said, turning back to his computer. I went upstairs to prepare the guest room for him, unsure of how long he would stay. He was still with me on Saturday, spending most of his time on his computer. I wasn't sure what he was working on, but we got to know each other better since he arrived on Wednesday. He mentioned he had been a sniper in the Marines and now worked for a joint federal private task force. Despite being trained as an accountant, most of his work involved research. He also shared some stories about how he and his wife, Amy, dealt with executives who crossed boundaries with her. I couldn't verify the truth of his tales, but they were certainly intriguing. The night before, he asked if it would be all right for Amy to join him for the weekend. I agreed, and she arrived around 9 a.m. on Saturday morning. After introductions, they took her things to the guest room while I quietly slipped out to the garage to give them privacy. After spending an hour in the garage, I returned to the house. Ron and Amy huddled around Ron's computer, deep in their work. Ron looked up as I entered. "Is there any news?" I asked about it. First of all, the FBI has taken control of the investigation. Secondly, we received confirmation of the identity of our victims about 30 minutes ago. All three of them? I asked. Yes, they're not far from Colorado Springs, Ron confirmed. I have already notified the colonel. He'll figure it out on his own. There's something else. What is it? I asked. I was able to access your wife's official autopsy report, he said. Oh? What does this mean? I asked. According to the report, your wife suffered a severe heart attack caused by the chemicals that Henderson injected. But that was not the cause of her death, Ron explained. Soil particles were found in her lungs. What does that mean? I asked. She was alive when they buried her, Ron said. I felt a wave of shock. I'm sorry. He paused, his expression darkening. Tom, but it seems like the last hours of her life were terrible. I find it hard to believe that she agreed to all this. What do you think happened? I asked. Based on what I've gathered, Henderson and his associates probably had quite a wild party, he replied. Your wife was heavily influenced by whatever Henderson had given her, to the point where she lost control. At some point, she suffered a heart attack. Instead of seeking medical help that could have saved her, they likely assumed she was dead and decided to dispose of her. I sank into a chair, stunned by Ron's words. Amy came over and embraced me as tears streamed down my face. Henderson and his accomplices are wanted for murder, conspiracy to commit murder, prohibited substances manufacturing and distribution, and organized crime, among other charges, Ron continued. Others seen in your recordings have already been arrested and are facing legal action, but Henderson is the primary target. What do you think will happen to him? I asked. Ron shrugged. Who knows, he said. With the state of the courts these days, it's anyone's guess. The next morning, I woke up abruptly to the ringing of my phone. Glancing at the clock, I saw it was 4:30 a.m. I wondered who could be calling at such an hour. Answering the phone, I heard a disguised voice instructing me to check my text messages before abruptly hanging up. There was no caller ID, adding to the mystery. Opening my messages, I found a video showing 3 men tied up. They were dumped in front of a brick building. I immediately recognized them as Henderson, Lenny, and Harvey. Henderson wore a sign around his neck that read, "Note to FBI, I murdered Katie West." I pondered whether this clue would be enough for the FBI. After closing the video, I managed to get a few more hours of sleep. When I finally got up later that morning and went downstairs, Amy was already in the kitchen cooking bacon and eggs for the 3 of us. I hope you don't mind me using your kitchen, she said. Ron gets cranky if he doesn't have his morning bacon fix. Not at all, I replied. I can get grumpy myself without bacon. Help yourself. After breakfast, just as we finished eating, there was a knock on the door. Opening it, I found Ryan standing there. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Sure," I said, welcoming him inside. I introduced him to Ron and Amy, explaining they were friends of my father-in-law. "Would you like some coffee or anything?" I offered. "No, Tom. I won't stay long," Ryan said. "I just wanted to inform you that Henderson and his 2 associates were arrested in Colorado Springs early this morning." "That's positive, isn't it?" I inquired. "Yes," he replied. "I hear they're cooperating fully. There are just some concerns about how they were apprehended. But I assume you're unaware of that." "No, I'm not," I replied. "I've been here the whole night. Ron and Amy can confirm that." "Uh-huh," he nodded. "Well, I just wanted to inform you. I'll leave you all alone now. Take care." "Thanks, Ryan," I said. After he left, I turned to Ron. "You don't happen to know anything about that, do you?" I asked. "Ask no questions, get no lies," he said with a knowing smile. "But I do suggest you call your father-in-law and express your gratitude." I nodded and took out my phone. "Anderson," Bill answered. "Dad, the police just visited me," I said. "They informed me Henderson and his accomplice were caught in Colorado Springs." "Well, that's good news," he said. "Ron suggested I call and thank you," I added. "He did?" Bill chuckled softly. "Yes," I confirmed. "So, thank you." "You're welcome, son," he replied. "I assume you received a message last night." "I did," I said. "Nice touch with the sign. Think it helped them figure it out?" Bill laughed. "I sure hope so," he said. "Talk to you soon, son. Take care now." "I will, Dad," I said. "Thanks." The following Monday, I went to work and handed in my resignation. Everyone expressed regret at my departure but understood my reasons. After that, I visited a real estate agent to discuss selling the house. I knew I had a lot of work ahead of me. We had lived there since our wedding day, and the place held 2 decades of memories and accumulated clutter. It took another week for the medical examiner in New York to release Katie's body. As promised, her parents took care of the funeral arrangements. I had mixed feelings about attending the service. On one hand, I had loved her exclusively for over 20 years, and felt a significant part of me had died with her. On the other hand, I struggled with what she had done at the end. I wondered if it was solely the prohibited substances Henderson had given her, or if there was more to it. Ultimately, I decided to attend, mostly for Bill and Alice's sake. They had been kind to me, and I felt I owed them that much at least. Jim managed to take a few days off from West Point to attend the funeral. It was comforting to see him again, and we mourned Katie's death together, reminiscing about the good times we had shared as a family. I chose not to share with him what had happened at the end. He had always been close to his mother, and I saw no reason to tarnish his memories of her. With the funeral behind me, I consulted with a lawyer about pursuing legal action against Ryder. I wasn't sure how far the lawsuit would go, but the lawyer believed there was a strong case against Henderson and the board of directors, particularly given their multiple criminal charges. The trial of Henderson and the board members involved in the 2-day meeting with Katie seemed endless. The U.S. attorney acting as the prosecutor demanded the death penalty for Henderson, but the defense rejected a number of unfounded petitions. I fulfilled my obligations by sharing my personal experiences and listening to the opinions of others who have done the same. Brenda also appeared in court and told the jury that Katie was not the only woman. When asked directly, she admitted that she doubted whether Katie and Henderson had an affair before that critical weekend. A video obtained from Henderson's office showed that Katie initially rejected most, if not all, of Henderson's advances. However, over time, it became obvious that she liked the idea of involving me in their activities. During searches of Henderson's office and residence, evidence of his experiments with prohibited substances was found. Through the testimony, I finally pieced together what happened to Katie. Henderson allegedly kept her intoxicated with prohibited substances and alcohol throughout the weekend. At one point during the prolonged event, she suffered severe chest pain and collapsed unconscious on the floor. The men informed the jury that they had checked her but were unable to detect a pulse. Instead of taking her to a nearby hospital, which was just minutes away, they presumed she was deceased. After hastily cleaning her, they placed her in the trunk of a car and transported her to Central Park, where they buried her. When questioned by the U.S. Attorney, none of those involved claimed to have CPR training or qualifications to assess her medical condition. Their fate was sealed when the medical examiner testified that he found soil in her lungs matching the soil from her burial site. In essence, he informed the jury, she was buried alive. I observed several jurors gasp at this revelation. At the conclusion of the trial, Jake, his 2 associates, and all the participants of the weekend gathering were found guilty on all charges. The judge opted against the death penalty, sentencing Jake to life imprisonment along with Lenny and Harvey. The others also received prison terms, though somewhat less severe. The legal battles against Ryder and Henderson intensified following the criminal trial. By the end of it all, the company had lost nearly all its clients and was placed into receivership. Henderson, after paying a substantial settlement to me, was eventually driven to declare bankruptcy. The aftermath of Henderson's scheme to betray me far exceeded his expectations. Katie had passed away, he and his collaborators were imprisoned and penniless. His once beloved company was essentially defunct, and countless individuals were left unemployed. Meanwhile, life moved forward for me. The house was finally sold, and I purchased a comfortable 2-bedroom condo. Although bidding farewell to the house was bittersweet, I looked ahead to the future. Encouraged by my therapist, I decided to take a break and possibly embark on a cruise to meet new people. That's exactly what I did. I booked a round-the-world cruise, grabbed my tickets, and hopped into an Uber headed for the airport. First stop, Miami. Then onward to destinations across the globe. The possibilities ahead were wide open.